Let me throw up two more books. Just so I want to get into the next category, but I realized that I didn't put up the last two. The experiences are wonderful. The experience is extraordinary, but how do we know these people aren't just imagining, and how do we know that they aren't really just kind of, it's a beautiful story, but how do we know it's really a true story? And Pimmel van Lohen, he's a Norwegian doctor, and this book is, there have been a number of books of this type, but I think this book is the very best scientific evaluation of the near-death episode phenomenon. He really puts it through all the paces. He looks at it from different angles. He looks at the cases. He looks at the arguments against their legitimacy, and he just patiently sifts it out. And so if you want to look at a book, or you have that, if you have a husband at home that's just an engineer, he's hypercritical of thinking that this is just not real, this is the book you want to look at. Just because this is the best critical analysis of the phenomenon. And lastly, I would mention the fourth one, Proof of Heaven, Eben Alexander. Some of you have met him and know of his work. And he's kind of the man of the hour on some of this work. And we have this in the bookstore. Emery has his work in the bookstore. And I think Eben is doing great work. I mean, he's really out there. He's pitching hard. He's absorbing a lot of abuse from the academic community, but his experience really is powerful, and really he's doing good work, and I think this is a beautiful experience. Okay, so let's go to the next category, life between life theory. Now this work actually began with this book published in 1988 by Joel Whitten and Joe Fisher. Joel Whitten is a Canadian psychiatrist who was doing past lives therapy on behalf of the Canadian government, by the way. He was interested in exploring this, and he accidentally gave an ambiguous direction to one of his clients, and suddenly he found that his client was not remembering a past life, he was remembering a life between past lives. He didn't even think that this was possible. But he discovered, and he began to regress people back. When you went back into a former life, and then you went through the death in that life, he found that he could escort people into the place they went to after they died. And when he had done this many times, he published this short book with Joe Fisher, who's a newspaper reporter, Life Between Life. And this is really the beginning of this research. But the man I'd like to show you primarily around this work is this guy, Michael Newton. Backwards. Michael Newton, and all three of these books are Michael Newton. And we have two of them, right, Anne-Marie? We have two of them in the bookstore. These are wonderful books. I mean, these are just wonderful books. Michael Newton, likewise, was doing research, doing past lives therapy. He was taking people back to heal their circumstances in their present life by taking them back to their former lives and uncovering the trauma and so on and so forth. And then the same thing happened to him. He gave an ambiguous instruction, and he discovered that people had the capacity to go back into their life before they were born, the life between life, what happens between death and birth. And he began to incorporate this into his therapy, and after he had taken 600 people, right, so just imagine, if you're a therapist, how long does it take you to have 600 clients going back into this phenomenon? And he kept detailed records. He wrote this first book, Journey of the Soul, in which he basically summarizes, always staying close to his cases, what people experience in the structure of the postmortem state. And then that was followed, what was the date? It's in your bibliography I gave you. 2000 is the next one. Destiny of Souls. And these two are really kind of like two halves of the same book. I mean, they're really, Destiny of Souls gives you more detail, but the phenomenon is the same. He's just going into it in greater detail. And then memories of the afterlife. What happened is Michael Newton was seeing so many patients. Psychotherapists began to come to him, and he began to train the therapist. So he stopped working with patients so much as he began to work with therapists, and he created an institute. And so now now this is the fastest growing area in hypnotherapy and past lives therapy, and people who are being trained not only to do past life regressions, but to do between life therapy, because it deepens and accelerates the therapeutic process. So that all of this last book are collections of cases by a different therapist. So they will get the therapist, describe their background, how they got into this, then they present one case, then they move on to the next therapist. So you see that the third book is actually published by the Newton Institute. So the first two books are Michael Newton, the third book comes from the Newton Institute. Now, there are so many wonderful things to share with you from this material. Like the near-death episode research, it just is so consoling, and it is so illuminating to have a clear description of the death experience as the return to ecstasy. Here we go into the next step, into the nuts and bolts of the world we return to when we die. So let me just kind of share some observations that you'll find in these books of Newton. He says, and first of all, everything that we talked about with near-death episode research, all of that phenomenon is replicated in life between life therapy. The same phenomenon of taking the tunnel, the encounter with the light, layers and layers of light. He talks about levels that his clients talks about levels of light all woven together in stratified threads, a series of rising dimensions above the physical or tangible world. They become less dense as one moves farther away from the heavy influences of Earth. He talks about there's a period of orientation, that when people would die in this past life therapy, they would go into some type of very comfortable, consoling environment, a park, a lake, something very familiar, and they would orient. And then once they were acclimated to this new condition, then they would go beyond that deeper into the death process. So there is a technology, there is a whole cadre of beings whose job it is to help catch people when they die, to help them reorient to the true nature of infinity. Yes.
Can I just say something that just brought to mind? There's a movie, and PM, you probably know exactly, in Margaret. It's with
Defending
Meryl
Your Life?
Streep.
Defending Your Life?
With Meryl Streep.
Defending
Meryl
Your
Streep.
Oh,
Life.
that's Meryl, Defending Your Life. This is
Yeah.
exactly...
Very
this is
similar.
Exactly, maybe not, okay, very similar, because this is what just...
I think that movie is what would happen if IBM could get the Bardo contract. They go to this place that looks like Dallas, and you can eat as much as you want, and you're defending your life, your kind of life is reviewed and whether you go on and that. It's something like that. How many people die every day in the world? Hundreds of thousands of people die every day. Well, that's a lot of people to catch and integrate, and it doesn't happen like some big machine. It takes personnel. It takes beings to catch several 100,000 people every day.
Do they have a health and retirement plan?
Retirement plan is pretty good.
Benefits?
He says that there is a whole, first of all, where we go when we die, there are many, many, many layers where we go when we die. There are many layers of the spiritual universe. And not everybody goes to the same place. Everybody goes to the same home, but it's a condo of many layers, and you don't all go to the same layer of the condo. He says there are many guides, many beings, and even the guides have guides. And the basic principle is the more experienced coach the less experienced. And this happens up and down the system, that you find that you had to have guides, and those guides have supervisors, and those supervisors, they have guides, and there is a hierarchy of guides. And what is it that determines one's placement in that hierarchy is really simply their spiritual maturation. It's open-ended. It's a spiritual maturation process. He says that ghosts, as Hollywood presents, actually they're very rare. It's very rare for people who get hung up. You can get hung up in the exiting process, but what Hollywood has inculcated as all these kind of shadow phenomena and scary things that happen when we die, it's an insignificant percentage of the number of people who are dying. The large majority of people go through those intermediate territories without problem.
Now we're all worried, are we in that small percentage?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you some percentages in a minute, because he has some statistics he's worked out on stages of soul development. But a couple of other things first. First of all, reincarnation is just an obvious fact of life. As soon as you're out of your body, you know that reincarnation is just true. No ifs, ands, or buts. That's it. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. Right. Period. Secondly, there's no hell. The concept of hell is just a distorted, incomplete perception. Everybody goes home. Now, that doesn't mean, if you were a mean son of a bitch, and you hurt people, and you cause people pain and suffering, you're going to have to deal with that, and there are processes and beings who are there to help you deal with that. And there are people who can be so damaged by their earth experience, they become so hateful and so filled with so much malice that very special circumstances are required to bring them back into the wholeness of spirit. Right? And he discusses those, particularly in the second book, Destiny of Souls. He discusses this in great detail. There are beings whose specialty is working with highly damaged souls, damaged beings who've been hurt so traumatically. He says there are soul clusters, that we are not in this alone. We actually, it's like going to college. Everybody, you matriculate in a group, and this group stays intact through the entire journey process. Yeah. He says that he calls them soul clusters. He says there are 5 to 20 beings in your soul cluster. The average he finds is about 15. So there are 15 beings who, at every incarnation, they come back together. They don't necessarily incarnate together, sometimes, but when you're in between life, you come back together, and you are immediately transparent. One of the things that happens in the spirit world is you can't hide anything. Everybody knows everything about you, and you know everything about the beings that you are with. And your debriefing of your most recent life experience is done in the context of your soul cluster. And each of the members of your soul cluster may have guides, and sometimes they're different guides, and sometimes they're the same guides. But that there is a social matrix within which this is all taking place. Younger souls tend to stay more tightly clustered with their soul cluster. Older souls tend to kind of go off and do things more individually, but they always come back. They're always part of the soul cluster, and the soul cluster basically goes through the experience together, but not necessarily at the same pace. Some members of the soul cluster may proceed very slowly, and other members of the soul cluster may proceed faster. How do you know who's going faster? He says, well, all you have to do is look at the color of the light. He says, as you become more mature, the energy of your being, which is light, changes color. And he has kind of a model of a sort of rainbow spectrum of the stages of development reflected in the colors. And he says it's immediately obvious where a person is in their development just by looking at their color. Okay? He talks about stages of development. He does his statistics, he keeps track of things, and he differentiates 5 stages of soul development that he's been able to identify. So the question is, what's the percentage in those 5 stages? Here's his statistics. Level 1, 42%. Level 2, 31%. That's kind of discouraging, isn't it?
Yeah.
That means 73% of all the souls that he's worked with are at levels 1 and 2. That's 3/4 of the world's population in levels 1 and 2. Level 3, 17%. Level 4, 9%. Level 5, 1%. Here's a couple of, he says, quote, I have had many cases where a client has been incarnating for up to 30,000 years on Earth and is still in the lower levels of 1 and 2. On the other hand, he said, I once had a client who entered into a level 3 state of awareness after only 4,000 years. An outstanding performance. So,
Would you read those percentages again?
okay, percentage. Level 1, 42. 2, 31. 3, 17. 4, 9. 5, 1%. Now, I'll just mention something. One of the things I really like about Newton is he stays with his data. He is true to his data. He gives you cases for everything he says. He gives you examples that come from his cases. I love the empirical side, the disciplined side of his work in that respect. But that's also, from my perspective, is also the limitation of the work, because he can only reflect the statistics of the people who come to him to work. And as he himself says, it tends to be kind of younger souls who find their way to him. I mean, the Dalai Lama has never gone to work with Michael Newton. Great saints and great beings don't tend to need working with therapists to explore these dimensions. So that his figures tend to be skewed somewhat, I think, in the lower direction. Also, his description of the nature of post-mortem existence is skewed to what, in the Tibetan vocabulary, you would say is the lower half of the bardo. He tends to give from my perspective, a more detailed and accurate description only of the lower half of heaven, not of the higher dimensions of heaven.
But that's okay, because that's where most of you are going.
Yeah, I mean, it's good, and believe me, there's plenty of joy to go around. It really is, but it's not, I don't find it to be reflective of the totality. It's reflective of half of the totality. All right?
In my father's house are many mansions, so we're in the house. We're just in different mansions, we're in different aspects, yeah.
You know, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in Buddhism, they talk about 6 levels, the 6 lokas, the 6 realms of existence: hell beings, hungry ghost beings, animals, kind of marked by ignorance, human beings, low heavenly beings, high heavenly beings. Each of these are subdivided into 8 hot hells, 8 cold hells, 8 intermediate hells. There are 26 high heavenly realms. So like hundreds and hundreds of realms divided. And at one level, this is a teaching about where we go when we die. From another level, it's a teaching about what's happening right here, because in this city, there are hell realms. There are some beings who are living in the hell of violence and anger. There are some beings who are living in the realm of greed and insatiable appetites. There are some beings who are living in the high heavenly realm where everything there, silver spoon in their mouth, everything is fine. They've always had plenty, they've always, So it's bardo reality, the intermediate state, but it's also in the physical world. We're in this condition right now. Those who have more experience help those who have less experience. Guides, help souls, souls help each other, high guides help lower guides. He differentiates, he has his own vocabulary. He talks about watchers. There are junior and senior watchers. He talks about sages. He talks about the old ones who are beyond level 6. You know, that just there are the old ones, and the old ones are kind of, you know, he talks about a council of elders. When you die, and when you orient, and when you debrief with your spirit guide, somewhere in there you're going to be brought before the council of elders. And the elders are these old ones. And before you incarnate, when you've chosen your life, when you've done a number of things, you go before the council of elders. So this is like, we're all in this together. It's a collective. That's why I talked about the community of heaven. There is a social matrix. There's a world in which there is a social structure. And it's a social structure which is not hierarchical in the sense of the old ones are more valuable than the younger ones. There's not a value hierarchy, because we're all divine. We're all of the divine. That's the fundamental truth. But there is a gradient of expertise. There's a gradient of development. And that's just accepted as an obvious truth. So on the one hand, everybody is equally valuable, and older learners help the younger learners to grow. You know, there's a structure to it. There's a logic to it. And he talks about some of the different worlds of that reality. He talks about the world of altered time is one of his languages for it. He talks about the world of creation and non-creation, and the world of all-knowing. Let me translate those phrases. The world of altered time is like a holodeck. You've seen Star Trek? They go to the holodeck, and when you go on the holodeck, you can have any experience you want to. He says you can do that when you die too. And there, you know, what are you doing with all your time in between, from death to birth? He said, well, you can go into this place called the world of altered time, where you can go into this holodeck and you can experiment creating reality. You can just create anything that you can imagine. It's a holodeck. He says there is a world of creation and non-creation. I call it Earth 2. There is an actual physical world where you can go and you can experiment with your creative abilities, but it actually is a tangible world, and you can spend as much time there as you want, where you're flexing your new muscles and you're experimenting with doing things. He talks about, what are you doing? He says, well, one person reported that they were learning how to make fish. I mean, well, that's not a very noble aspiration. They're literally using their mind to create physical form. And the idea is that, you know, where did all these new forms that show up in evolution? You know, our current thinking is life creates things randomly, and then they're screened by survival of the fittest. But from Newton's perspective, that's not really quite the whole story. There is a creativity inherent in the universal process, and you can practice that creativity, and there are beings who practice the creation of new life forms. And eventually some of that practice manifests in the manifestation of new life forms on Earth, which I like to think about when I'm looking at those coral reefs with all those beautiful fish and thinking, how is this all coming about by accident?
It gives me something to hang on that hope where Jesus said, ye are gods. We are creative beings, and whatever else he may have meant by that. But this is in that chapter for me, that ye are God's place.
Yeah.
That we're creative beings.
We're creative beings. And you have to practice creativity. You have to learn to control the powers that are yours by your virtue of your nature, but you can practice it and get better and better at it. It's like learning how to play chess. Everybody's got the capacity to be a master, but you have to practice at it. Practice creating. He also talks about this world, the world without ego. This is the spiritual maternity ward. I mentioned this to you before. This is a place where new souls begin. And it's one of the most beautiful sections of, I think it's Destiny of Souls, where he talks about these beings who are kind of like maternity ward nurses who catch the new souls. They don't have a self-identity yet. They're raw. It's like a solar flare coming off of the sun. And they catch them and hold them and cater for them and basically help them awaken to individual existence. World without ego, meaning world without sense of self. By the time they leave the maternity ward, they have a sense of individuality. They have a sense of self. It's a and not all beings, not all pieces of energy make that transition. It's like some of them don't congeal into an individuality, in which case they are kind of reabsorbed into the totality, and they catch more. So it's not like there's an assembly line. Okay? And he says, one person said, I didn't know myself, ask myself, until I was moved into this quiet place. So a new soul is not capable of choice. They don't have, he says, they're not self-shaped. Once you have a self, once you have a sense of individuality, he says it's your signature. And you'll have that signature forever. He says, quote, once given, ego becomes a covenant between oneself and the givers to do the best I can with who I am. Who I am changes. What I am doesn't change. The essence doesn't change, but who I am, the form changes, but the covenant with the divine is to do the best you can with who you are. That's the covenant of individuated existence. As I mentioned before in my dialogue with Irvin Laszlo, my experience is that individuality is one of the precious gifts of existence. In fact, I think it's probably the greatest gift given by the Great Mother. So for me, only part of the divine manifests as the physical universe. Part of the divine is outside the physical universe. The physical universe is the only thing that is hard enough that it has the strength to break up the wholeness of the divine into individual parts. So it's kind of like the being of God has such power that it takes something as dense as physical matter to break off little bits and pieces of the divine to develop individual capacity. That individuality is the great gift of the Mother. It actually is the great gift of physical existence itself. The experience of being an individual, so that whatever happens, we will always be an individual. We won't be swallowed up and lose our identity forever. Now, you know that most idealistic philosophies, like interpretations of Hinduism and some spiritual visions say, well, you see, when you achieve enlightenment, then when you die, the drop returns to the ocean. The self you dissolve into the totality of being, and you cease to exist as an individual. I'm thinking of a bad word right now.
We can all hear it.
I don't believe that that's true. That's not the truth in my experience. In my experience, that no matter how many times the ego dies, it gives birth to a deeper individuality. When that individuality dies, it gives birth to a still deeper form of individuality. Individuality is one of the great gifts of the creative enterprise. And I don't think we do return to the source. We do return to the all. But the universe didn't spend 13.7 billion years gestating this individuality just to have it reabsorbed into the totality. So we go back to the totality, but not so as to suffocate our individuality, but actually enhance and deepen our individuality.
Can you define that individuality as say, between the oneness and Bunny, the personality, where does that individuality fall? What is that? What would that look like?
In Dark Night, Early Dawn, where I'm exploring a lot of different areas. I'm exploring the connective tissue of consciousness. I'm exploring collective consciousness and exploring the relationship between individual evolution and collective evolution, how they're all intertwined. So with a deep appreciation for the connective tissue that we are all part of, the last chapter in that book is called The Fate of Individuality. Because I address the question, some religious systems extinguish individuality, and I don't think there is. So what is that individuality? And the closest I can get to a definition of it is a functional definition, a process definition. It's the capacity for integrated experience. I can't get more specific than that because the nature of individuality changes as the soul matures. And so if you can't define it in terms of content, because the content is open-ended. But what does seem to be consistent is the capacity to integrate experience. So you're integrating, you learn, you integrate, you become more. You learn, you integrate, and you become more. And this is why I really don't agree with Laszlo, that that the universe just creates egos and then swallows them up into the Akashic memory. The Akashic field is real. But individuality is also real. And it's a both and. And I think we can use Laszlo's field theory to actually describe the dynamics of the soul in a way which is more accurate, but it's truly a both and situation.
Thank you.
Gary, and then here, and then here.
What do you think about the concept of, I've heard from Shinto and other traditions that ultimately the soul creates their own universe?
Newton and some others have said that when a soul kind of graduates at a point where you can continue in the spiritual world if you want to, or you can stay within the physical enterprise if you want to, but if you are a graduate, you can create an entire universe. You can create an entire universe. Right? That we are the types of beings. We think of ourselves in such underestimating terms. We are beings who can create galaxies once mature. That's the size and scale of what we're talking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
We're doing that workshop next week.
But there was here and then here. Here?
Yes. To what Gary was saying, in '86, I experienced, and I was talking at lunchtime with others in here, I called it I didn't know at the time a spiritual emergency, for lack of a better word. And rather than having all of the beauty, it was like I created Dante's Inferno.
Yeah.
I was born Pentecostal wholeness, and I created that hell within myself.
Yeah.
To me, as I was going through that, it was 18 months that I was in that. My family just kind of left it open for me to pretty much experience, although they were scared, but through that time I knew that my soul was so damaged until I was experiencing what my soul was feeling. And somehow I knew that I was working things out,
Yeah.
But 18 months I was like that, and then all of a sudden one day, I said, well, I need to go and get some help. So I went and had myself committed. But, after that time, it didn't happen immediately, but 2 or 3 years after that, the entire time that I was inside, I called it, I went within, I didn't really feel like I was individualized. I didn't feel like I felt like I was a part of nothing.
Yeah.
I wasn't anybody, I wasn't, I couldn't do anything, I was nothing, I was little. Everybody else was big, but I was little.
Yeah.
But everything that went on in that time when I was within, I wrote about it.
Yeah.
So, through that writing and what I experienced, I found out that I could write.
Yeah.
And whenever I got outside of that, that hell become heaven, if that makes sense. Because it gave me an opportunity to pull from that hell that I was in and see that beauty, because I had been there.
Yeah.
I had done something. I was an individual person. God had took me in and told me secrets and showed me things that nobody else had seen.
Yeah.
So whenever I came back out, I had I was a totally different person with a different concept
Yeah.
than the person that I went in with.
Yeah.
So I guess in a sense of what Gary was saying, my soul did create the world that it wanted, but ultimately it was to get me. It was like, wake up, it's time to wake up.
Yeah. I don't believe in an eternal hell. I think
No.
that's an abomination. But I do believe that there are hell realms. And if a person goes through a very terrible traumatic experience, they have nightmares because they've got a hell experience living inside their psyche. And until they clear that, it's there. Now just think of all the terrible things that have happened to human beings in history. Think of all the people who died in World War I. Think of all the people who died traumatically in World War II, and the people who died in the Philippines this last week. Just think of the human family with all of the trauma that humanity has undergone. And if the human psyche is a single consciousness, if there is a collective psyche, then just as we have levels of our mind which have pockets of hell inside of them, then there are pockets of hell in the human psyche. And if you read the biographies or autobiographies of some saints and great practitioners, they go into these hell realms, and they spend a long time in these hell realms in order to heal not themselves, but to actually help heal, I think, the collective psyche of humanity. And so I think those realms are there. We get into them through all sorts of different, sometimes like a spiritual emergency. And they're bigger than we are. They have a power all of their own. And ultimately, even though they are long-lived in terms of history, they are ultimately temporary, because all trauma can be healed. And when it's healed, it clears. But humanity, if we are giving birth to a new human, if we are giving birth to a higher form of human life, we have to heal all of human history in order for human history to move forward. And that's why I think a lot of people who do spiritual practice, very deep spiritual practice, they spend a lot of time in the hell realm. I mentioned Roger Wilger, and I was giving a talk on this at a conference one time, and Roger was there, and he and I had lunch together, and I was talking about the hell realm, and I was talking about the discovery that when you go into the hell realm, it's not about healing yourself, it's about healing the collective. And he came to the same conclusion on his past life therapy work. He was taking people into past life, and he said there were just one lifetime after another lifetime after another lifetime, trauma after trauma after trauma. And he eventually came to the conclusion that this couldn't be simply people who had amassed a long history of trauma. Something else had to be afoot. And he became convinced that his clients were people who were taking on collective pain, taking on other people's lifetimes in a way of suffering in order to clear the collective field. And I think actually we are in one of those periods of history where the hell realm is coming to the surface. I mean, 21st century is going to be a hellish century. And all of this is part of a collective transformative process. You have to get out the pain in order to clear the system so that the system can take in greater joy and greater beauty. Thank you for sharing your experience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, when you were talking about signature, I mean, you know, this may sound kind of obvious, but when I meet a person, and you know, and yeah, I don't have to know them that well, but there is a sense or feeling that I have about them, over and above their words, looks, anything. It's like an essence, you know. And I think that's what you were talking about. But could it be that that aspect, that signature that you're talking about, could be just a divine gift of personality that goes with us throughout eternity? You know, just like we have a soul, and just like we have the spark of the divine within us, all those eternal elements, you know, that are helping build the moral body. You know, well then that personality, that distinguishing mark that even if 1,000,000 years passes by and we see that person, they don't have to say a word and we can feel their essence. You know, that personality.
I think I agree with the concept. I use a different vocabulary because our word personality is so connected to individual ego that it tends to carry that quality. So I just prefer the word individuality, but the way you're using the term personality, I think it's interchangeable. That basic concept that there is a unique identity. That identity is us at the deepest level. And it is a gift. We didn't give it to ourselves. You know, it was birthed in the system. And once birthed, it never goes away. It's always there. And I think you can feel it inside people. Yes?
About a year and a half ago, I purchased a couple of bottles of extra strength Tylenol, and I was going to end my life. So I took about, of the 200, I took like 175, and I wound up in Cedars-Sinai. And it was really weird because I was very at peace with what I was doing. I really, really wanted to go. But then when I spoke to the first doctor, he said to me, well, you'll probably have permanent liver damage, and you probably only have like 2 or 3 days to live. But I didn't know how to feel about that because, like, I didn't plan to wake up and have to deal with, well, do I? But that's not my question. My question is, there's quite a bit of suicidality in my family. So, is this show up in the books about suicidality, or have I picked another subject?
No, in fact, this also, there was a question asked earlier, what about suicide? You know,
I must have been sleeping.
well, I didn't answer it. We came up during break. So what about suicide? First of all, the past life therapy evidence is that suicide can become a habit, like anything else. Very logic. If you have a
We need another anonymous group.
if you get overwhelmed, you get in a situation where you just feel like you can't deal with it anymore, I'm going to end it.
It is a coping. It's a lack of coping skill. You know, it's like
What we find is that people who commit suicide in one lifetime sometimes have a tendency to choose that as an option in subsequent lifetimes.
Chris, can you hold the mic closer?
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. I feel like I'm smoking a cigar here. It can become habit forming, it can become an exit strategy, but it doesn't really solve things. Now, what are the consequences of committing suicide? I think the best wisdom I've seen in all of the literature is the consequence of committing suicide is you have to repeat the grade. If you flunk the 5th grade, we don't take you out and torture you for the rest of your life. We just simply say you have to take the 5th grade over again.
yeah.
So not everybody commits suicide for, quote, bad reasons. I mean, but if you choose suicide out of inability to cope, the worst that happens, I think, is that you have to come back in maybe even more demanding circumstances in order to face the challenges that you weren't, and to solve the issues that you weren't able to solve before. I've mentioned Robert Monroe, the Monroe Institute, and he's the guy who wrote 3 books, and he's an out-of-body kind of person. He created the Monroe Institute in favor of Virginia. He says you can check out anytime you want. Anybody can leave anytime they want without cosmic judgment. He feels very strongly about this. But it doesn't mean that there aren't karmic consequences, not in the sense of judgment, but of habits that can get established. And I don't think suicide is a successful coping strategy. It just interrupts the process. And then you got to get born again, you got to go through gestation again, you got to go through diapers again, just to get yourself back into the situation where you can face whatever it was that took you out the last time. So it's one of those things where I don't think it's the worst thing that you can do, but it's not the best thing either. So best to work with what it is that you've got yourself into until you can get through it. But if you've lost someone to suicide, they're not outside of love. They're not outside the universe. They go home. They don't go to hell. They go home. I'll tell you another piece of research. There was a guy who wanted to study near-death episodes of people who attempted to commit suicide. So he studied, this is an early study, David Rosen. He studied people who tried to commit suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. You jump off the Golden Gate, you got about a 97% chance of dying. So it's a pretty serious suicide attempt. He found that there were 8 people who had jumped and survived. He was able to track down 7 of them. He also tracked down 6 people who had jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. I guess the Bay Bridge. I guess if the Golden Gate is busy, you can always go around the corner. Here's what he found. He found that every person who attempted to commit suicide by jumping off either of these bridges went instantly into ecstatic, transcendent state of consciousness. They went straight into the near-death episode, white light, totality of consciousness, instantly. And not a single person ever tried to commit suicide again, because they learned the soul is not killed when you kill the body. Nothing is solved by committing suicide. It just delays the inevitable. So they weren't punished, but they never tried to commit suicide again because they discovered that suicide is an illogical action. Because you think you can solve the problem by killing the body, you do not solve the problem by killing the body. I think that work I thought was really
I heard one of those people interviewed a lady,
yeah.
and she said that she just was grateful that she survived and never tried again, like
Yeah.
you say, process whatever her issues were.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chris,
Yes.
do you, in your perspective and research, do you feel like the research is showing that our prayers, our blessings, our thoughts are impacting those beloveds who did suicide, or impact those beloveds we know have crossed over with huge amounts of angst or fear? Our prayers and thoughts impact them in a positive way?
Yes, I think so. The community of heaven is a community that is in rapport with the community of earth, and we who are embodied can communicate with and assist those who have died. And in the Monroe Institute, there's a program they actually train people how to go into a state of consciousness where they literally kind of leave their body and find people who are stuck in the postmortem state and actually assist them and take them into the park, he calls it. And once you're in the park, then you'll be able to get on from there. But a lot of people, some people, not a lot, a few people, when they die, they don't know that they're dead. Or they're confused, they're just kind of disoriented. We can get to those people and help them move beyond their uncertainty and their fears. In Tibetan Buddhism, which I practice within, among other things, there is a practice called Shitro, which is a practice for the recently departed. And you do the practice precisely for someone who is dead in order to bring to them the opportunity to move to their soul who might otherwise get caught. My sister works for hospice, And so when she gets clients who are having very difficult death processes, when she'll ask me to do Shitro for them. And so I do a lot of Shitro for people I don't know. And it often happens when I'm doing this practice that I see things. I just get visual impressions. And so I always am really careful because, you never really know exactly the truth of what it is you're seeing, but I relay them to her and she relays them to the client's wife, mother, whatever. And I find consistently, we find that what I see, that what is seen contains a core truth which identifies that it's real, that this person is actually there. They're wearing a particular shirt, or they're sitting in a particular chair, and it's the real shirt, their favorite shirt, or their real chair. And I have many times helped people get into the clear space, the diamond light space. And this is a practice which has been taught for over 1,000 years. So there's thousands and thousands of beings, as a matter of course, think that they can help the beings who have died to get where they need to be in order to make clear decisions. So I very, very much believe that we can do that. Yes?
My husband died last year, and I was having a hard time, I was feeling his energy, but trying to block it off,
Yeah.
because I thought it would go past quicker if I did that. So I really started to feel like I was going crazy a little bit. So this very intuitive person told me that he was in a learning place, and that he couldn't process a lot while he was alive because he had autism, which no one knew about, those days. So anyway, so he was in a learning place to process this life, but he couldn't. And that she thought his grandfather or someone like that was with him, someone who loved him, was with him and helping him. And after she told me that, all of a sudden, his energy, everything made sense.
Yeah.
And she said, just be open to it, just be open to his energy. And I really felt then that my relationship with him wasn't over, and then I was actually helping him while he was in that learning place. Like when I would remember him or feel his energy very strongly, like I was helping him to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's, I don't remember the exact percentage, 60, 70% of husbands and wives whose spouse dies have the experience of being in contact with them in some form or another. It's a majority experience that people have the experience of the recently departed. And that's the most natural thing in the world, in a universe that I'm describing here. Of course they would want to come back and touch base. Of course there would be some rapport. And if there is that rapport, then we can help them. Yeah. Yes?
So her husband, who she's speaking of, was a very good friend of mine. And it was so interesting. When he was very, very, very close to death, so he had hospice come in. So this hospice woman, because there was so much prayer, and and she could feel so much prayer, and so much going on, just prayer. It was basically prayer that she was feeling, and saw Maureen and people, we're Buddhists and we chant, so she saw so much prayer, for lack of a better word. Even on Randy's dying moments, he was still able to encourage somebody, this hospice worker, with his life, even though he was ready to go here, he was still here in spirit. And this woman, this hospice woman, was so encouraged by the family and by the prayers that she saw and by Randy's life rather than Randy's death.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we know that to be so because she's come back to his year memorial service, she's come back to, I think she came back twice to something we have, I can't remember exactly, Maureen, but anyways, it was all this incredible experience, even though here, there was still so much encouraging going on here.
Yeah.
Prayer, there was so much prayer that was clearly
Yeah.
seen.
Yeah. It's, all this, I mean, we understand that death is weeping and hurting. We're left behind. But for the soul who's leaving, it's joy and celebration. And the more we can hold joy and celebration, the more we can hold the deep vision, the more we can support them in the process that they're going through. You know, the worst thing is the weeping and gnashing here, to really think that this is real, that death is taking place, termination, endpoint. This is all there is. And that's what my students are taught in practically every course at the university they take, except mine. You know, they're taught biology classes, chemistry, all their courses that death is the end. Doctors are failures if your patients die. Well, death is graduation. Death is the great release. Not that it's for permanent release, but it's the great release. Let me do a time check. Okay. It's time to shift categories. Are we ready to shift?
Yep.
All right. I hope you read, we got 2 of these in the bookstore. I hope you read these books. These are wonderful books. Time to go to psychedelic research.
Did you bring enough for everybody?
Margaret and I were talking about this workshop. I'm working right now on Dark Night, Early Dawn is about psychedelic research, and I'm working on a book which is kind of the next book in this series. And psychedelic research is my area of specialty as a philosopher. And so we said, okay, I said, how about if we do this on the discussion of death from the different perspectives? And psychedelic work is part of that for me. And if people are okay with it, if we find that people are comfortable, maybe I'll come back next year and we'll do an entire workshop on psychedelics. Because we have so many misunderstandings and so many fears about psychedelics, and I think it's so important. I think psychedelics represent a before and after in philosophical work because it changes the landscape. So just a couple of things. First, we've been doing this for a long time, and these are 3 books which I'm just bringing here just to point out that psychedelics have been with humanity for a very long time. And I'm not going to talk about these books, I just want to mention them. The first book, Forest of Visions, written by Alex Polari, Amarenga. He's one of the founders. There are 2 ayahuasca churches in Brazil, Santo Daime and Menino de Vegetal. Ayahuasca is a very powerful psychedelic which results from combining 2 particular plants. Its usage goes back 1,500 years. It's integrated with Christianity. You know, once the Spaniards came and brought Christianity, there's an amalgam. And it's a very, very powerful healing substance. Americans are doing ayahuasca, and there's a community in Ashland who has taken their case all the way to the Supreme Court and won the right to use ayahuasca as non-Brazilians, as Caucasian Americans in their community. So when they bring the ayahuasca from Brazil, they're met at the airport by a Department of Drug Enforcement Agency and a representative of the church. It's coming into this country. There's another ayahuasca community in Houston, which has likewise won the right to be doing ayahuasca. The second book is a book by Ralph Metzner on ayahuasca. It's an anthology, people's experiences, so on and so forth. And the third book is also by Ralph Metzner. It's an anthology on sacred mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms. Native Americans have been using mushrooms for years as a healing ritual. They've used peyote, they've used mescaline. This is nothing new. So what I'm going to talk about is not new. What I'm going to talk about is the rediscovery of this ancient healing modality in contemporary scientific context. All right? So the person I want to talk about is Stanislav Grof, who is the foremost authority, I think, today on integrating psychedelics into the therapeutic process. He was Czechoslovakian born. He started his work after graduating from medical school. The first day after he graduated from medical school, he did his first LSD session. He is the foremost authority on the psychoactive effects of LSD and integrating it into the therapeutic process. He's written about, I think, 15, 16 books by now. Stan is in his upper 70s. This book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, changed my life. It was published right about the time I finished graduate school. So when I came out of graduate school and I began work at Youngstown State, it was only then that I became aware of the real significance of psychedelics. I didn't do drugs in high school. I didn't do drugs in college. I did not do, well, a little bit of drugs. I did do drugs in graduate school. It was only when I was 29 years old that I began to systematically begin to work with psychedelics. Now, in 1978, when I finished graduate school, my government had made psychedelics illegal. It had said in 1969, 1970, there is no value to these substances. They're going to be scheduled as we criminalize them. That put me in a hard spot because Stan had just begun to publish. He had already published hundreds of articles. There were literally 3,000 essays published on psychedelics in the 60s and 70s. Tremendous therapeutic potential, but you know what happened. The 60s happened, and then everything came crashing to a stop in 1969. I knew that psychedelics were going to come back eventually. I knew that they were so important that our culture was going to not abandon them, that we would find our way back to working with these very powerful sacred medicines. But I knew that by the time we did that, I'd be an old man. And I was not willing to wait. So what I did was I began to work with psychedelics using Stan Grof's methodology, and I'll describe that methodology in a second. But that meant going underground. And I became part of a community of people who are working conscientiously, therapeutically, and philosophically with psychedelics, not like Timothy Leary, not like Ram Dass, not like Richard Alpert, who, Ram Dass in his previous incarnation at Harvard, but doing it in a different kind of modality. But that meant going underground. And I'm now beginning to write up that work. Between 1979 and 1999, I did 73 high-dose LSD sessions, massive quantities of LSD. I've probably done more LSD than just about anybody you know. But I don't look that crazy, do I?
You're not talking about street drugs, you're talking about pure LSD.
I'm talking about pure pharmaceutical grade LSD. What you get on the street, very different animal. And I'm not talking about tripping. I mean, I've read all the literature on psychedelics, and if you want to see all the things that went wrong in the 60s, you can read a book called Storming Heaven, which is a history of psychedelics in the 60s. There's another book called Tripping, where people share their experiences of tripping. I'm not talking about tripping. What's the difference between the therapeutic use of psychedelics and tripping? First of all, let me just restrict myself to LSD. Yeah, go ahead.
I really hate to do this, but I didn't ask two questions I had about the previous
Can you get
session
in?
we were
All
on,
right.
and I really regret I
Sure.
can't tie into this. But
Okay.
when people are, when we're at that jumping off place and that clarity that or suicide or checking out, that realization that we can't leave, we can get rid of the body. I had that experience. It was very powerful. It was just one of the most powerful experiences I ever had. And it was so clear
Yeah.
that I would just have to start over, be stuck there, just was not an interesting place, and it never crossed my mind again in a real way.
Yeah.
I've also had an experience kind of induced by some of this stuff and other things where there was no way I could see the things I was seeing with my eyes, and I was way too far away where I could normally hear people, and felt like I was leaving and torn in that state of absolute bliss, but also not done here, and knowing that I wasn't done here. But what I thought was a hallucination, over time, after connecting with people that were within a few short distance of that place, where everything I heard them say was what they were saying, the direction they were standing facing, everything they were doing and saying, they told me was real. I thought it was hallucination, but these were all real experiences.
Yeah.
And the questions of this presented some of the other things said in that.
Yeah.
I got really confused when I first got here because I have a strong belief system in something that I can't really understand. But this illusion of separateness, I believe that we're all interconnected, but I don't comprehend it in words. But also this illusion of time and space. Do you believe we talk about these different spaces that we go through, different transitions, that we can access any time and space if we're in tune?
It's tricky. Einstein taught us that the universe we live in is a time-space. It's a four-dimensional universe, right? 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. And so time and space is a unified fabric. And we have reasons to think that there are parts of the universe which are traveling faster than light, and therefore they are not inhibited by time the way we are in the large size of things. If you are able to enter into a state of consciousness in which you move beyond space as we know it, part of that is also moving beyond time as we know it. And so I know from personal experience that it is possible to move into what psychologists call trans-temporal experience, or to move in a different temporal reality, to move outside time and space as we ordinarily think of it. But it's not like there's time and then no time. There are many there's a permeability and there are many variations on the time-space continuum, so that you can move into states of awareness where 1,000 years will pass in 5 seconds. You're in a temporally dilated state. You can move into 100,000 million-year time landscapes. This is just the way time exists in those variables. And you can move completely outside time and space reality altogether and go into reality which is not time limited at all. So I think that there are variations on this process.
And when we tap into those things where you were talking about, what shirt someone was wearing, or examples like that which I've experienced, and like I said, I thought they were hallucinations. Do you think that's a amplified clarity of what's just hypersenses?
It's not that there are not hallucinations, which is to see something which isn't real. But there are true, legitimate visions where you see things which are real, but are not restricted by time-space reality the way we conventionally think of it. Traditionally, we say all of it's hallucinations. But there are people who have experiences and people who have near-death experiences who go into the future, and that future happens the way they saw it. Enough that we know that it is possible to have vision, to have experiences of future reality, even in this time and space moment. So we know that it's possible. Then after that, we have to go to the particulars.
But also what he's talking about, our consciousness can be in more than one place at a time. So our consciousness can be expansive enough that we can pick up on a conversation or see things, hear things, sense things, where our body isn't over there, but our spiritual sensing, I guess is the best term that's coming to me now. We can, we have that available to us.
A woman's playing golf, And at a particular tea at a particular time, suddenly she has an overwhelming sense that one of her children is in trouble. And she plays out the golf game and she goes home and she gets a phone call as soon as she gets inside, and it turns out her son had just had a car accident exactly at the minute when she felt it at that particular time on the golf course. So part of her is obviously capable of sensing beyond her physical senses. And we have lots of cases like that. What's the difference between tripping and serious psychedelic work? First of all, and of course there are many psychedelics. I mean, you have to take them individually: LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, MDT, DMT. So I don't want to oversimplify, but basically, what we mean when we classify a substance as a psychedelic, and I never use the word hallucinogen, because that's a pejorative, materialist description, because a hallucination is when you see something which isn't there. But that's to make a metaphysical judgment, and I don't want to use that category. Some people call it entheogens, that which awakens the divine within. That's okay if you have a pretty broad definition of God. I prefer the term psychedelic, mind opener, mind expander. What these substances do is they hypersensitize consciousness. They amplify consciousness. They do not give you a particular experience. They do not cause you to see 2 people, 100 people on a psychedelic do not have the same experience. They hyper-amplify your consciousness. And then what happens is a function of consciousness itself, not a function of the drug. It's a function of the aroused state of consciousness. Usually, when people take psychedelics, they're usually taking it recreational. They want to kind of have fun, have a party. And they use this hyper-stimulated state, and they stay in dialogue in the physical world, and the physical senses come in, their hypersensitive consciousness kind of rises up. They get a swirling mishmash of hallucinations and trails and spins, and they kind of have some fun, go to a party, and the music is so intense, and the insights are sort of so interesting, and da-da-da-da. And when it's all over, nothing has changed. They've just kind of entertained themselves for a few hours. The Native Americans are not interested in tripping. They were only interested in serious, sacred medicine work. And the difference is this: when you work in a therapeutic modality, first of all, you isolate yourself from the physical world. In the old days, they would climb into a kiva. You know what a kiva is? An underground cave, an underground hole in the ground, where they go down a ladder, and then you're sitting around a fire, and you pull up the ladder, and you're there until dawn. In contemporary context, you're lying down and you're wearing eye shades. You're not in any contact with the physical world, so that whatever you experience, you know it's coming from you. And that's kind of important. And then you're listening to very carefully selected music. And if a psychedelic has a particular time curve, we know if you're taking LSD, it's going to have an acceleration, it's going to impact within about total of 45 minutes. You're going to be on a peak that's going to last maybe 4 or 5 hours. It's going to have a tail that's going to last another 3 or 4 hours. And we know that we can choose music that will support what happens in each of those stages. So there's essays and works which have been written on the kind of music you want to help you break through and to confront what you need to confront, and then slowly integrate and then slowly come back and return. It's a complicated process, but the basic vision is this. When you hyperstimulate your consciousness, what starts to happen is that your consciousness starts to purify itself. It starts to heal itself. And in order to heal itself, it has to bring forward what needs healing. So it has to bring forward all the pain. It has to bring forward anything which is unfinished business, and sometimes from this life, sometimes from other lifetimes. It brings forward physical trauma. When you had whooping cough, when you were 5 years old and you almost died, and the physical memory of that is still in your body. It brings forward all the existential questions. It brings forth all the deep, deep philosophical questions. It brings forward all the uncertainty we have about whether life is meaningful, whether there is any logic to the process. And basically what happens is as the system begins to detoxify itself, you come to crisis points. And most people, when they confront these crisis points, the same thing to do is kind of run away. You do not want to go into the pain, you want to get away from the pain. But in therapy, when you're working therapeutically or as a sacred medicine, you learn to go into the pain. You learn to go deeper and deeper into what it is that's causing you problems. If you learn to go into the pain becomes your ally. And you suffer. You suffer terribly. You suffer physically, there's tremendous physical pain involved, and you suffer psychologically. And you suffer existentially and spiritually. But if you navigate that crisis skillfully, if you have a good sitter, and by the way, you never ever want to do this by yourself. I mean, it's not safe. You need somebody there who's going to control the outer world. You need somebody who's going to be your lifeline. If you navigate that confrontation successfully, the pattern is you reach a crisis point, you reach a breakthrough point. And you have to be comfortable losing control, because you lose control. Your mind is functioning 100 times more power than it normally functions. You lose control, and you go through some type of death process. You go through some type of absolute loss of your life as you knew it. You die. And the miracle is, after you're completely dead, you wake up in a different reality, in a different world, as a different kind of being than you were going into it. There have been people who have done psychedelics, heavy psychedelics, for 100, 150 times that have never, ever gone through this process. It's not easy. It's not fun. It's excruciatingly difficult work. And all the Native American traditions know this, the ayahuasca traditions know this, the Eleusinian mysteries know this in ancient Greece, that Plato and Aristotle were part of. As a philosopher, when I read Stan's work, I knew that this was a methodology that allowed us to actually explore the consciousness of the universe in a way that there are other traditions, there are other ways to explore the universe. I mean, there are people who withdraw into the mountains for decades and decades of isolation and meditation to explore the universe. The Kalahari Bushmen explore the universe through trance dancing. Some people explore by nearly dying. It's a very effective way. It's a little difficult. Going through sacred medicine work is simply a different modality of doing what human beings have always done, and that is to explore the world that we live in. And very quickly you find out that your individual ego is just a shell. It's just a shell that you can dissolve, you can pop it. It's a balloon that just pops. And when you pop it, you move into a deeper state of consciousness where you literally are a different life form. You're not simply a human being, but you can kind of move into a state in which you literally become humanity itself. You can move into merger with the collective psyche of the human species. And the purification continues at that level. You go through the death rebirth process again in subsequent sessions, but now no longer as an individual, but now as humanity. You go through this cycle of death rebirth, I've learned, is a cycle that repeats itself over and over again, the deeper and deeper you go. Okay? Along the way, when you break through into this deeper reality, that's why I feel deep kinship with Eben Alexander and the near-death episode people, because they're talking about things that I know from personal experience. You can go through the death process before you actually die physically. And then in many ways, the spiritual death process is much worse than the physical death process, because when you go through the physical process of dying, part of you knows that the psyche's okay. Because you've been through this before. The psyche is not going to be killed by the body dying. But if you go through a spiritual death process, you're going through a process which is actually deeper than physical dying. Because that nucleus, which transfers intact after the death of the body, it is that nucleus which is itself dying in this process. Why would you do something as stupid as that? Why would you go into that much suffering in order to, and the answer is, well, I was trained as a philosopher. I wanted to know what the structure of the universe was. I wanted to explore whether there was any meaningful tapestry. I mean, I wanted to cross the ocean. I wanted to see what was there. And you can. You can explore what's there. You can come to have firsthand personal experience of the larger cosmos that we are part of. And it's not for everybody. It's not, certainly not for, I don't advise it for a lot of people. You don't need to do it. But you can do it. And if you do it, one of the things that happens is you lose your fear of death. Absolutely. For the same reason that near-death episode people lose their fear of death. Because you know experientially that you are a being who cannot die. It's impossible for you to die as a spiritual being. Your physical being can die, your personality can die, but that germ you were talking about, that underlying essence, that cannot die. It can only be liberated into deeper and deeper manifestation. So, if you wanted to look, now this, all the books I've shown you are kind of pretty easy reading. This is not a difficult book to read. This is his first book. But if you're, in terms of death, these books are what I consider the most important of Stan's many books, focused on the issue of death. Now, the first one, and the reason these look all kind of rumpled is because these are my books. I slapped them on the scanner and took a picture of them. LSD psychotherapy is a manual that was written in 1980. A manual written for doctors and nurses and psychologists on how to do LSD psychotherapy. It's a nuts and bolts methodology. He wrote this after LSD was illegal. And he wrote it for two reasons. One, he knew people were doing this work anyway, underground. And two, he knew that we would get back to it. We would bring it back within our repertoire of scientific investigation, and it was important to document. And Stan, by this time, had over 5,000 sessions with LSD sessions with his clients. He had been doing this work for 20 years before it was illegal. And he wanted to bring it down to document it. This is a technical manual on how to run LSD sessions, counterindications, screening indications, how do you manage it, the difference between low-dose therapy and high-dose therapy. Very different. Low-dose therapy is kind of peeling the onion by layer. High-dose therapy is like blowing through the layers very quickly, going right through the layers. It's a very different kind of project. He did low-dose therapy in Czechoslovakia, taking people into 100 sessions, layer by layer, resolving it layer by layer. Gave him a very detailed map. When he came to Spring Grove Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, they started a new research project working with terminally ill patients, cancer patients. They were terminally ill. It was not any attempt to try to heal them. What they were trying to do was prepare them for dying. And so they did a maximum of 3 sessions, high dose. They were experimenting with triggering a near-death experience, deliberately under controlled circumstances, and they succeeded. They succeeded.
Tell us how.
How?
Yeah. I mean, what did people report? I mean, was the anxiety about death so diminished that it was completely gone, or how? Give us a report.
Well, he co-wrote a book with his then wife, Joan Halifax, who's an anthropologist, who's now a Zen Roshi, called A Human Encounter with Death. If you wanted to see the actual details, go to that book, A Human Encounter with Death. What they were found that we can if you take a very, very high dose of LSD and you contain it and you compress it, you go through lots of layers, you go through a lot of psychodynamic layers, but you go through a death rebirth process that basically projects you into a state of consciousness, which is the consciousness that you move into when you die. From that perspective, you can awaken the awareness that we saw in near-death episode. People said, I was remembering. How could I have forgotten this? I was remembering. Well, that's what happens in these sessions. People remember who they are. They remember the deeper truth. Some people, one person was a very, very modest, he was a janitor, a very modest intellectual, and he was Catholic, very traditional Catholic. And he had a very, very detailed encounter with reincarnation. And he came back, he was all embarrassed. He really didn't know what to do because he saw the truth of reincarnation in his sessions. And he had to integrate that into his Catholicism. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is, okay, so I don't have the experience, I never, for lack of a better word, tripped. But I was very, very much in that realm, many, many people around me in that time, and everything you're saying sounds exactly what I've been personally witnessed in people. Of course, it was underground.
Yeah.
Of course, it was underground. So I'm not understanding the difference, and I don't want to get caught up here just on the words, tripping, or whatever. But what you're saying, I've seen that happen with people. Not in a not in the climate that you're talking about, but in outside of that.
Yeah. Yep. You know, if you take a psychedelic, if you take, let's stay with LSD for the minute. You do, if you stay in touch with the world, you know, people talk about a bad trip. And they say, oh, that was bad acid. You know, that was a bad trip. I don't ever want to go back there again. But in therapy, a bad trip is a good trip.
Yeah.
In the street, a bad trip is just a bad trip. It's something you want to avoid. You do not want to go into it. What you learn in therapy is a bad trip means your system is purifying itself. And you want to purge those poisons, and you want to go deeper into that. Because when you purge those poisons, your system is going to move into a deeper experience of reality. There are lots of times, and if you read the literature like this book, Tripping, you'll see people have all sorts of glimpses into interconnectivity and glimpses into, and they'll have, you know, various psychic experiences where they can merge with the mind of people around them or things like this. The difference is one of degree and one of clarity and one of lasting impact.
Lasting impact.
It's degree, clarity, and lasting impact.
So if you did acid and you changed your whole life, I mean, you know, we used to do acid when Sandoz trucks got hijacked.
Yeah.
And that was like the ultimate acid trip because it was pharmaceutical acid.
Yeah.
And it was in the 60s.
Yeah.
And it was exactly like what you're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things Stephen Jobs said was one of the better choices he made when he was in college was to do acid, you know.
Yeah.
I see that as having lasting impact with him. I mean, somebody said you wouldn't have your iPad if it wasn't for acid, and you definitely wouldn't have the music on it, you know. So I think I've been around people in all realms of drug use, people that are just screwing around and want to have a good time.
Yeah.
And the stuff that passed for LSD for some recent decades, which bore no resemblance to what I remember as LSD. But I've seen a lot of
Crick
people.
the discoverer of DNA now kind of has admitted that
Right.
the critical breakthrough came through when he was on LSD. And Rupert Sheldrake and his important morphic field theory was LSD that gave him that breakthrough.
And Alex Gray, who is the wonderful
Alex Gray.
visionary North.
So we may not have been doing it in a clinical setting, but you can't just write off all the things that came from that because they were entirely life-changing.
I don't mean to write it off or diminish it. I certainly don't. And they are life-changing, and they were culture-changing.
Yes.
They gave us a different culture. And yet, at the same time, there is a difference, because if you read, for example, I think the best history of the 60s is Storming Heaven, and I can't remember the author's name. It's a wonderful book. But what happened is a lot of that catalytic energy, it washed through us, but it didn't take root. It didn't hold. It changed lives, but it didn't change our culture the way we hoped it would. It just washed through. And what I hope is that when we come back into it in this next wave, we can get a leverage that'll help us change the fundamental culture, that'll help us change the understanding.
Chris, as you know, you and I talked about this, my hesitation to even having this segment in the workshop, because there's still so much misunderstanding
Yeah,
about psychedelic research.
yeah,
So there's a cultural prejudice about it still.
sure.
So, but the whole idea that these substances are naturally occurring and have been used for thousands of years
Yeah,
for expanding consciousness.
yeah,
That there has to be some good reason why these substances were a part of our human experience.
yeah,
And what I'm really interested in is looking at how many people now, current day, who are returning to this as the sacred medicine you're talking about.
yeah,
It hasn't always been used as sacred.
yeah.
As we know, we can take anything and make it sacred or unsacred. It's
Yeah.
certainly been used in unsacred ways.
Yeah.
But the sacred, ceremonial use
Yeah,
to expand our consciousness. This is what I'm looking at a lot of I know medical doctors who actually do ayahuasca with their patients a week or so before they do major surgery. You know, they're doing it as sacred medicine, and
Yeah.
that's really what I'm interested in.
yeah,
And I'm personally, I'm encouraged that more people in the medical field are catching hold of sacred medicine versus medicine that's killing us.
Pharmaceutical.
Yeah.
We're being killed by, quote, medicine.
yeah.
Yeah.
So if there's another way to use sacred medicine, especially with treating depression and anxiety and fear
And Johns Hopkins is doing a research project. They've already published out it. They're continuing on the use of psilocybin in depression. The use of psilocybin to treat post-traumatic stress syndrome. MDMA is being used with returning vets to treat post-traumatic stress syndrome. So we're beginning to bring it back into a therapeutic modality. Ibogaine is an African psychedelic which has an extraordinary capacity to interrupt addiction, even cocaine and heroin addiction, which, as you know, is the most powerful. The more it gets a grip on the soul, and it's hard to let go. Ibogaine can produce a window of detoxification of about 2 months that will allow you to then intervene, followed with interventions of conventional therapeutic interventions. So we have a whole new kind of generation of young researchers who are beginning to use the sacred medicines for healing. Now, personally, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not interested, my project is not healing. Stan is a psychiatrist, his project is healing. He's been all over the world, and he's developed non-drug modalities for entering into these states. I should mention, he was always doing certified protocols, government-sanctioned protocols, and when LSD was no longer legal, he and his wife developed a non-drug protocol for entering into these states called holotropic breathwork. And so that there are other modalities for entering into these states. I was a philosopher. I was kind of like Aldous Huxley you mentioned. I'm interested in cosmology. I'm interested in the structure of the universe. That's a different project than healing. But if we can get the sacred medicines back into the repertoire of healers, then underneath healing the personality and underneath healing the heart, there is healing the soul. And the only way to heal the soul is to connect with the essence of life, the essence of the soul itself. And when you take the healing down to that level, the only way to heal the soul is to connect with the universe and to enter into communion with the universe itself. And that is the classic work of mystics and saints and lifelong meditators. To me, psychedelics, they're not a shortcut. But what they are is an intensifier of the spiritual process. You can accelerate it. Now, I wouldn't do what I did again. I mean, I chose to work with very high doses. I did psychedelic work for 73 sessions. And there's a wear and tear that comes. I wouldn't take that aggressive an approach now that I know what I know. I would take a much gentler path into it. Having said that, I wouldn't trade the tentative name I'm working with on this book. It'll change maybe, but right now I'm calling it Stealing Diamonds from Heaven. Because imagine you could have a near-death episode like we just touched on, you're going to read in some of these books. Imagine if you could have that experience 40 times. That's what we're looking at. What if we could, not only just a few handfuls of individuals, what if we could take 1,000 individuals and take them into this initiatory process 100 times and gather all of their experiences and integrate them into a visual, a picture of the structure of the universe. That's what I think we're right on the cusp of doing. We're on the edge of being able to do that work. In the traditions that work with sacred medicines, you know what they say? They say these medicines were given to us by the sacred because the sacred knew when we incarnated we were going to forget. And so the sacred medicines are about remembering. They're about waking us up and helping us remember what we forgot when we incarnated. And what are we trying to remember? We're trying to remember who we are, what the purpose of life is, what is our connection to each other. We're trying to remember the fundamental truths of life. When you remember, then just along the side, death disappears. There's not an anxiety around death. The same insights that emerge in near-death episode work emerge in sacred medicine work. Death is not a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, Chris. I went to legal forum across where I did the whole interpretive breath work 10 times.
Yeah.
and what you're talking about right now is that I had an experience there that I have never had in my life. And it was transformative. I don't see the world like I used to. I lost all sensation of my body.
Yeah.
I was flying around out in space. I was hearing a lot of booming voices saying you are one with God. And I felt total bliss. And I did not want to come back. And the next thing I knew is the facilitator had her hand on my head and opened my eyes and she said, "Are you all right?" Okay. But that was an absolutely tremendous experience like that. I can't. It's like anybody who goes through any of the experiences, you can say in words. There's no language to describe that. It's an experience that I had, and there's been none in life that has duplicated it.
In a way, the psychedelic aspect is a red herring. It's like it's not about psychedelics. This holotropic breath work, you know how they do it? Hyperventilation. Internal body work, music, and hyperventilation for a couple of hours at a time. Psychedelics is just a method. It's not what we're looking at is the released potential of consciousness, the nature of mind itself, and that's the important thing. And you can release that power by nearly dying. You can release that power with hypnosis, or But you can release it through psychedelics or meditation.
Meditation, thank you for mentioning that.
Let me mention, my first wife, whom I love dearly, she was my sitter for all of my work. For 20 years, she was my sitter. She's a clinical psychologist. She never did a single session herself. She's she's a very spiritually oriented person. Her path is meditation. She's completed her 3-year solo meditation retreat in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. She's a natural meditator. She never did a psychedelic session, but she was my lifeline during all of my psychedelic sessions. And it was only after doing about 15 years of this work that I began to understand her. So it's not about psychedelics. It's about different methods for working with consciousness. We're coming to the end of our time. Let me just mention, The Cosmic Game was written 4 books after LSD psychotherapy. Stan wrote several books written for clinicians, written on the clinical methodology, looking for all the indications and so on and so forth. Eventually he wrote a book which is about the cosmological implications of this work, the model of the universe that emerges from deep psychedelic work. And that's this book, The Cosmic Game. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And then later he wrote this last book, The Ultimate Journey, which he specifically, the ultimate journey is death. And so he's looking, it's a masterful scholarly work, but also integrated with his own personal experiences and other psychedelic voyagers' experiences, exploring the phenomenon of death from that perspective. So it's the straight-on implications of psychedelic work for the experience of dying. And then I just mentioned one last piece. Where'd my clicker go? Yeah. This is Dark Night, Early Dawn. All of my work is basically situated within Stancroft's tradition. This is my first book on psychedelic work, and so I incorporate, I think if you're going to do philosophy in this genre, you have to reveal the experiences that are the foundation of your thinking. All philosophical reflection assumes a shared experience. If I give an indication, a counterexample in an argument, I'm assuming that we have a certain body of experience, and so if I give an example, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But most people don't have advanced psychedelic experience. So if you're going to present a philosophical argument based upon experience, you have to be willing to put your experiences on the table and say, these are not perfect, these are incomplete, tell me where I went wrong, but these are the experiences that I'm using to draw these conclusions. And so I integrate my own psychedelic experiences in this book, I put them on the table, and I integrate it in a discussion with other people's exploration and using different methodologies. This way of doing philosophy is a new way of doing philosophy. Here, we temporarily lose contact with the physical world. We go into a non-ordinary state, we have a set of experiences, we come back and write them down, and then we analyze them. I've spent now 14 years analyzing 20 years worth of psychedelic experience, and it's only now that I'm really beginning to write the whole story. It's not enough to have an exotic experience. You have to understand it, you have to think about it, you have to plug it into the literature, you have to think about you have to plug it into an intellectual landscape in order to extract its philosophical value. Along the way, I'll end with just one experience, small experience, just I was being taken out into what I call deep time. Out into deep time, into the opportunity to see where humanity is being taken, into the future human time, into that world. So we're on a scale of hundreds of thousands of years. And I was going, and all of a sudden, everything expanded. Real quickly, all of a sudden, I was just going, and pop, everything popped. And I said, what happened? And the intelligence I was with said, oh, we passed your death. It's like I was going forward in time, and I passed when I would die, and when you pass your death, you don't have the glue that holds you in a particular configuration. You just expand in that larger domain. I've gone in and out of that space so many times that it's kind of become, I'm more comfortable there, and that's why I love the near-death episode research. The difference with the near-death episode research and this type of research is this. When most near-death episode people only have one shot at that reality. A few of them have had 2 or 3 near-death episodes, but mostly you get one shot. You get an intense experience, but you don't always see the full landscape because you get a quick, it's like seeing a landscape in Arizona at night, and you get a flash of lightning that shows you the landscape, and you see it all, but you don't see it all. But if you could go back 40, 50 times, then you have a much deeper perception of that reality. Also, because you go through many death and rebirths, you go deeper and deeper into reality, deeper into the cosmos itself, and you get a more complete portrait of what's real. It's not about psychedelics. It's about the nature of mind. It's about exploring the nature of the mind of the universe. And along the way, along with all the other work we're looking at, death, what is death? Death is your best friend. Death is, absolutely nothing to be afraid of. I can't tell you how much I look forward to dying. That's the last thing I want to avoid. And so I have an agreement with Jesus. You come for me, I'm gone. I'm not fighting this. This is, don't come for me until you're ready, for us to wrap this thing up. Because death is your good friend. Thanks very much for
So Chris, I know that there will be a group here who will always love you to come back. And if everybody knows that Chris is our guest speaker in the morning at 11 a.m. service, and also we have a surprise guest musician singer from Agape International Choir and the Center in Santa Monica. So she just happens to be passing through and has family in Georgetown, so she's coming to us tomorrow. So we have the divine duo. So thank you, everybody. And thank you.
There we have it.